Hello YouTube, today I'm going to be showing you how to replace your rear motor mount on either your first or second generation Mazda 3 and also your third generation Ford Focus. I'm going to be doing this on my Mazda 3. This is a second generation model with the Skyactiv powertrain manual transmission, but they're all going to be the same whether you have Mazda 3 or Ford Focus. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be removing the under tray on my Mazda 3. There are going to be a total of 7 bolts you're going to need to remove. There's going to be 3 right here, and there's going to be 2 on each side, which support the middle of the under tray, and there's none for the back, at least on my car. On a 2013 Mazda 3, you're going to need a 10mm socket, preferably a deep socket, so you can get into these first 3 bolts, or you can use an extension, but I'm going to be using a deep socket. Once you get your under tray off, it is time to support your engine with a floor jack. And since I'm going to be supporting it with the oil pan, I'm going to be putting in a wood block in between the jack and the oil pan, just so the oil pan doesn't get punched through by the jack, which has a metal end on it. The wood is going to be quite a bit softer. You're going to want to support your engine with a jack because once you start removing the rear motor mount, the engine's actually going to start dropping out of the car. So you're going to want to be able to keep the engine in the same place so that you can get the bolts out for the rear motor mount and so that it installs smoothly. It's also a safety concern. You don't want the engine to drop out on your head. As you can see, in my case, I had to use 2 blocks, but now we're ready to get the rear motor mount off. To remove your rear motor mount, you're going to need a 17mm socket with some sort of breaker bar or cheater bar, because these screws are really tight. The next thing you're going to want to do is remove the bracket for the rear motor mount, which is this piece right here. You're going to want to remove these 3 bolts. They're the same size as the bolts that you use to take off the rear motor mount, 17mm. The reason being is because if you try to take out the rear motor mount without taking out the bracket, you're going to see that there's not really any clearance, so you have to take off this bracket. When you go to remove your rear motor mount, the first thing you're going to want to do is actually remove the rear motor mount bracket, which actually happens to be connected to the transmission, not the engine. So first thing you're going to want to do is actually remove these 3 bolts. They sit actually behind right here. The reason you want to do that is to provide yourself some clearance to remove the rear motor mount, because I had actually just tried to remove the rear motor mount without removing the bracket and I could not get it out in any way, shape, or form. So you have to remove the rear bracket. And also, when you go to remove the rear bracket first. Remove these 3 bolts first. Do not remove these 2 bolts first, because if you remove these 2 bolts first and you try to get the rear motor mount out first, you're going to be stuck with trying to remove the rear motor mount bracket while the engine is not connected. And when you try to loosen these 3 bolts with a breaker bar while this is not connected, the whole transmission and mount assembly is going to be moving back and forth. You're not going to be able to get any leverage to get those screws out. So when you go to remove your engine mount, remove these 3 bolts from the transmission first from the bracket. So basically get the bracket out, and then you can remove this bolt right here, and then actually no, do this instead. Loosen this bolt so that you have some movement, so you can wiggle this thing out and move it around more, and then remove this bolt. So this way you have some movement, you have some leverage, and then this way you can get this bolt screwed out, and then you can pull the whole mount assembly out from the frame. As you can see, this is loosened already because as I said earlier, I tried to just remove the engine mount without the bracket and it did not work. So I had to put the screws back in and basically remount the rear motor mount so I can get some leverage on these 3 bolts so that I can remove those. So here is the rear motor mount completely taken out of the car. This is the bracket and this is the mount itself. And I'm going to show you why I am replacing this part and why you might be replacing this part as well. So as you can see, if we take a look at it, if I press my thumb onto this part of the mount, you can see that the rubber is cracked and it's actually separated from the mount. If I flip it over, it's more easily visible. You can see where the rubber has cracked right there. And if I push on it, you can see why the engine would move around. It's because there's no support. The engine mount is torn and it's basically literally almost really hanging on by a thread. So if that's the case, you know, if you start your engine up and it shakes and vibrates a lot, which is what was going on with my car, this is the problem, and you're going to want to replace this almost immediately, because this car has 3 mounts, right? And you got to think of it like a bridge. If one side of the bridge is about to collapse, then the other side of the bridge is going to collapse. So if one motor mount is gone, your other motor mounts have a higher chance of failing. So if you don't replace one motor mount, you're going to have to replace another motor mount down the line, and you'll end up having to replace 2 or even 3 motor mounts. And that's exactly what happened here. My top motor mount, my passenger side motor mount on my car went out. I did not suspect that I needed to replace that mount super soon. I replaced the mount, and then days later, this mount went. So I ended up having to replace both mounts now. But that's okay, because not only are we going to be replacing this mount, we're going to be upgrading the rear motor mount on my car as well. I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it. It's a little different from what most people say and recommend, but I believe this is actually going to work out very well. Out with the old, and in with the new. If we flip these over, you can see the condition of my old motor mount with the new motor mount that I'm going to be putting in. So if I move this around, as you can see, there's the cracked rubber. Obviously right here, this is the new mount. If I try to move it around, it's much harder, and there's no cracked rubber. That's going to really help with the engine shaking under startup. The problem with going with either an OEM mount or a solid rear motor mount is that they both have their pros and they have their cons, and you have to compromise between the two. So while my car sees a lot of highway and street driving, it's also used in performance driving, autocross. So I need kind of the best of both worlds, and that is where my solution is going to come in. With an original or OEM motor mount, like the one that broke in my car, you're going to notice that with these style motor mounts, they're going to provide the best road comfort. They're going to provide the least amount of noise and vibration inside of the car. But during performance driving, the issue with these motor mounts is that they allow the engine transmission to move around a little bit to prevent all that vibration and noise from coming inside the cabin, all that shakiness. But the issue with this, with performance driving, is that when you go to accelerate, the torque of the engine is going to move this around, right? And what happens is you're going to have power losses that are transmitting to the drive wheels. And that is not good for performance, because when you go to run the engine, the overall drivetrain is not going to be as responsive. So when the engine twists, it's going to twist the motor mount first before basically it twists the wheels first, type of deal. So for my application, especially with autocross, that's going to be important. And for that reason, an original motor mount is not going to make the most sense here. So what a lot of Mazda 3 enthusiasts end up doing instead for performance is going with a solid motor mount or a billet motor mount. So all that is this piece basically, but it's actually just one piece of metal. So there's no space in here. It's just a solid piece, and it just screws into the car, and it's very solid. So while your engine and transmission will not twist or move under power nearly as much or hardly at all, it's going to transmit quite a lot of noise and vibration when you're cruising around with the car on the highway. And this car, yes, I do performance driving with it, I do autocross with it, but it is also my daily driver. It is the car I drive to work and the car I drive around in general on the road. So having a solid motor mount is going to be a little uncomfortable, but an OE motor mount is going to move around too much to where it's going to be a little detrimental to the car's performance. Not by much, but a little bit. It's better to have a more solid mount. So here's my solution. I have bought a very cheap replacement motor mount. Usually these come about between $50 to $70. This one was $20. Now, a mechanic will not recommend you to go with a cheap motor mount because they're more likely to fail. But like I said, I have a solution. I have these polyurethane motor mount inserts. Let me show you how they work. So with the motor mount, as you can see, there are these gaps which allow this solid metal piece to move around within the rubber insert that's in here. But with these polyurethane inserts, what they do is these tabs, right, fill in those rubber gaps so that it makes the mount more solid. It reinforces the mount, but it's also let's get the other piece here. It's also, as you can see, it's pliable, so it's going to make the regular motor mount more solid, like a solid motor mount would be, but it's also going to allow for some movement and some extra comfort when I'm driving on the highway. I believe this is going to be the best solution. It provides the best of both worlds, and it's also much cheaper compared to not even going with original, but also going with a solid mount. Most original mounts are between $50 to $70. If you try to go with a solid mount, usually you're talking between $150 to $200. This together, the cheap mount was $20. These inserts are $15. You're talking about $35, $40. So I'm not sure how you can beat that. And because the insert will reinforce the motor mount, you don't really have to go with a super high quality motor mount. You can go with a cheap motor mount and just insert these, and it won't really matter because these will reinforce the rubber that's inside of the motor mount. Now I'm going to clean up the rear motor mount bracket and insert my polyurethane engine mount inserts into my rear motor mount, and then we can go ahead and get this installed onto the Mazda. All right, I just finished reinstalling the rear motor mount. Now it's time to drop the jack and get the under tray back installed so we can take this out for a drive. All right, so before I go putting the under tray back on, let's just check and see to make sure that everything is tightened up together and finalized before I go ahead and put that tray back on by starting the engine up. Let's see how this feels. Wow, absolutely no vibration, no shaking at all. That feels much better.